So it really depends on how much you guys know or how comfortable you guys are with scripting languages or like traditional programming languages like Python. That will have a great influence on the type of content that I choose to emphasize in today's lecture. So it would be really great if you guys could just jump in. You guys can turn on your cameras or ever raise your hands or whatever, and let me know if you're not familiar with a particular concept and you'd like for me to talk about it a little bit more, or if you think that there's enough people that kind of know a general programming concept. Since this general series of courses called JS61A, it's similar to the way that CS61A is kind of structured. We're going to be talking about programming fundamentals in general, so stuff like variables, loops, control flow, and the way it's going to be structured is mostly going to be demonstrative. So I'm going to share my screen and go through different types of ways of writing code instead of making it extremely content heavy. The HTML lectures and CSS lectures are more content heavy because there are things that you kind of need to know how to kind of structure a particular program, what tags are, how to reference, I don't know, just how to reference other files and things like that. But mostly for this, it'll be learning through example, if that makes sense. So yeah, okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. I'm guessing, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm guessing that some of you are either interested in or are taking or have taken some sort of intro to programming class, either in high school or at Berkeley, something like Data 8 or CS10 or CS61A. So this is something that will, if you're already familiar with a lot of the syntax and conventions of things like Java or Python, it will be very easy to pick up JavaScript. JavaScript is just another one of those types of languages, extremely powerful. And it turns out that it is a very good medium for communicating with the HTML and CSS code that we write. And just as a brief, I guess, intro to how this is compared to the other stuff that we've learned so far. HTML and CSS sort of that works with it. HTML is a markup language, so it provides static content on web pages, as you've definitely heard before. And JavaScript is something that can sort of be embedded inside HTML. It's like a puppet master that controls everything behind the scenes and makes things dynamic. And so that's the way that we could sort of I guess maintain things like on-clicks or events that the user can interact with, or ways to make our website fancy. And JavaScript is supported in most major browsers. So similar to HTML, it's pretty much universal. But you do need some sort of JavaScript engine in order for the browser to actually understand what's going on. But yeah, so essentially we have HTML that manages providing all the static web content and to the server, whereas JavaScript is more like a client-side sort of thing. It can also be server-side, and it could be used on the back end or on the front end. We'll talk a little bit about front end, I guess, in this in today's lecture. We're going to be talking about generally how to structure JavaScript in the console in some sort of simplistic environment, like a REPL environment. But you can also work with JavaScript on the backend through things like Node.js, which will also be available on the backend track. So that's something that you'll be able to learn as well. Yeah, so JavaScript also has a bunch of libraries and things that it supports. So not just vanilla JavaScript, but also React.js, Angular, Vue, and of course there's various other types of very important libraries like Express that you can sort of utilized to have like more and more advanced functionalities. But the whole point of JavaScript is that it's such a robust and powerful programming language that you can use vanilla JavaScript to accomplish many, many tasks. So hopefully just get familiar with it in the context of the other programming languages that we've learned. So yeah, to the people who just joined, we're going to be doing JS61A, which is essentially like the fundamentals of JavaScript. And I will be sharing slides just for the first little part, and then after that I'll be making it more of like an example sort of thing. So let's do some JavaScript. So hopefully you guys again have seen some of this kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about before. It'll make things a lot easier, but if not, it's totally fine. It'll be pretty easy to pick up on this, I think. We're going to be talking about things very simply today, and then in the future, as you continue to take CS and programming languages classes at Berkeley or wherever else, it'll integrate very nicely with JavaScript, because JavaScript, like I said before, is a scripting language as opposed to like HTML, which isn't. It's not sort of in contention as to whether it counts as that sort of programming language. It's more of a markup language. But essentially, it works on making static elements dynamic in your code. So you have, for example, like a button that is clickable. The clickable functionality of the button is handled by the JavaScript. And also, things like logging things in consoles, and even to a certain extent, operating some sort of redevelop print loop like environment, similar to Python. You can do all of these things in JavaScript. Yeah, this is not something we need to think about too much, but JavaScript is single-threaded in the form that we're going to be looking at it today. So similar to Python as to how it sort of executes linearly, that's the kind of form that we're going to be looking at it. Yeah, again, not too important. But yeah, I just included that you can comment things out with these with the forward slashes, but that's something that you'll definitely learn. This is as opposed to Python, which has a more of a which you can like comment things out with the hash symbol. Okay. And generally, when we're trying to code, what we want to do is try to make things as simplistic as possible. So we want to communicate whatever we're trying to do as clearly as possible. So of course, in JavaScript, there's no exception to this type of thing. We want to structure things very cleanly in things like functions and variables and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about those, I guess. Yeah, so this is there are various different ways to declare variables in JavaScript. There's the const method, there's a let keyword, and there's also a var keyword. They have slightly different use cases. I'd say in general, we tend to use const for the vast majority of use cases, especially on the front end for JavaScript. Const means that it is, you can't reassign the variable afterwards. So once you declare the variable with like, instead of saying like int something, we would say like const var name and equals whatever it is, whatever type of data type we're working with, string, Boolean, number. We can't reassign it, but that's not to say that it's like immutable. It is mutable, and maybe we'll go a little bit into that later. And yeah, there's just some sort of complexity when it comes to like objects and object properties. The other way to declare a variable is to use the let keyword. The let keyword is like well scoped, I guess it would be a good way to put it. And also it is mutable. I guess it's also, it supports reassigning the variable. So you can definitely do that with let. But in general, like as a JavaScript like programming, best programming practice, we want to use let or var or const, whichever one is the least powerful to actually accomplish the methods that we're trying to accomplish. So if we're trying to simply like inject the URL link of a particular URL like google.com or something inside some sort of a tag, we might, in React, we might want to save it as like a const. Const link is equal to www.google.com in quotes, and that would represent a constant variable that you're not really going to change throughout the scope of your program, but which will be very useful in like actually injecting itself into the HTML code. All right. Yeah, and I just want to say, like, I'm not gonna be able to like read comments that easily, so if you have like any like questions or anything like that, you could feel free to like either raise your hand or just unmute. And yeah, we can talk about that. Okay. I don't think we talked about some of these things. So in JavaScript, we have restrictions on variable names, similar to that of Python or Java. Of course, we can't have spaces in the middle of a variable name. So const var name, you can't have a space in between those things. In Python, we tend to put underscores in order to separate like two words inside a variable and connect them at the same time. But in JavaScript, we want to use camel case, similar to Java. So if you're not familiar with camel case, that's basically like where the C is like similar to this idea right here. The C is like the first letter of the first word is not capitalized, and the first letter of the second word is capitalized, and all the following words after it. That's sort of like just a general programming practice when it comes to JavaScript. There are three major types in JavaScript that we're going to be focusing on, and we'll also talk about like object types and things like that. But this is essentially, these are, you could think of these as primitives. So a string is basically anything that contains like text of some sort, and it's wrapped in quotes. So multiple characters or even one character can be wrapped in quotes. And these quotes can be, I believe they can be single quotes or double quotes, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I do think it's single quotes or double quotes. And then Booleans are also values that are true or false. There are truthy values and falsy values. So like an empty array, for instance, would be the example of a falsy value, I think. And so 0. But there's also false and true, which are Booleans. And as opposed to Python or Java or any of these types of languages, we have numbers in JavaScript, which encapsulate all the different types of number types that we are used to in other programming languages, like Python, or I guess more relevant, Java. So things like int or double or float or anything like that that you might find in things like C will all be condensed to the number type. So if you say like type of 3.21, it'll be the same as type of 3. Both of them will be a number. And this is just one example of how JavaScript is a little weird. Has these weird little quirks and nuances. So one of those types of things is like what happens a little bit with traditional control flow in Java, in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we have if-else statements, just like any other programming language. And so there's if, there's else if. And when we actually look at the equalities in order to sort of establish conditionals in those if statements, we usually want to use the equality operator that is the triple equal signs instead of the double equal signs. And we know that the assignment operator is 1 equal sign. Instead, in JavaScript, we want to use 3 equal signs. Mostly. There are exceptions to this, and we can talk about, why you would want to use one over the other. But at a high level, essentially, double equal signs want to, they try, like JavaScript under the hood tries to like cast them to be the same data type in particular. So this image right here is sort of a good example of how that could easily go wrong. It tries to cast these to be the same type. So I think it casts the 0 to be a string 0, which is in fact equal to the other string 0. So JavaScript spits out true, even though obviously this is not a true statement. So if we did the triple equal sign in this case, it would actually return false, which is the value that we want, because it does strict comparisons. And the while and the for loops are similar to that of Java, in the sense that, for example, a for loop, you would have the like let x is equal to 0, x is less than, and then a conditional, or x is conditional, and then some sort of iterator inside the loop. Okay, I'm going to take a breather here since we talked about a lot, but hopefully you guys should be like somewhat familiar with these concepts. Okay, I'm going to stop for like a little bit so you guys can let me know if you have any questions or anything like that. Any questions at all?
So will we go over like const and let and var later on in more detail, or is it not that important to know? We just need to know that we should usually use const.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about when to use what today, and I'll do that in like the demos a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. But yeah, do you kind of get the general idea behind it? Behind these sorts of things?
Yeah, I think it's just because it's like a new concept, so I'm like confused, but then I also kind of get it.
Okay, got it. All right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we'll just like get started and like, yeah, let's go ahead and look at the console now, just to get accustomed to it, I guess. All right, I'll stop screen sharing for just a second. Okay, can you see this? Did everyone see this? Or? Okay, looks like it. Yeah, so this is sort of a website that turns JavaScript into like REPL type of code, so we can sort of see how things are executed in a linear fashion. And this is just one of the quirks that I want to talk about really briefly before we sort of did some like more interesting demos, I guess. This kind of demonstrates like something about JavaScript. So we can, of course, I haven't talked about this, but we can sort of like add things together and subtract things similar to that of Python. We can use as many like different types of operators as we want. Division, subtraction, everything is actually supported in JavaScript. So this works. And we can also use like traditional string concatenation. So we're adding like two strings together, and that sort of just shoves them together, as you can see here. But this right here is weird. 2 plus 2 minus 2 is equal to 20. That is definitely strange. And the reason for this is that, as I said before, JavaScript is weird. So if we add 2 plus 2 together, string like via string concatenation, similar to the above, we get 22. The plus operator is sort of like allows us to do concatenation in the traditional sense. And concatenation just means like putting strings together in various ways. So hello plus world would be hello world, right? So hello plus world, hello world. But when we do like hello minus world, what happens is JavaScript actually tries to convert it to like compatible types that only work with the subtraction symbol. So this will be an error or not a number, because subtraction would only work for a number. so what it does in this case is it tries to convert 22 to a number. It can do that, and it tries to convert 2 to a number. It can also do that. So it says 22 minus 2 is equal to 20. It does that implicit sort of string casting all on its own, and it returns 20, which is weird. This is also something that sort of makes sense. But yeah, sort of wanted to just kind of get you used to something that's a little bit weird about JavaScript.
Is NaN like the null value for JS?
Yeah, but in this case, they're referring to not a number. So it's just saying that this is not a number. Okay. So yeah, I guess now we can talk about like the const versus anything else. So const. Okay. Const. Let's say something like. Let's use the example from notes. So monthly rent equal to, I think it was like 100. And at the end of a declaration, we sort of have to put a semicolon, similar to that of Java. I think that sometimes JavaScript doesn't enforce putting semicolons, so it is able to sort of tell when the line ends all on its own, but sometimes it's not. So mostly we want to go ahead and do this right here. This is one way of declaring a variable, something like that. I guess it's already been declared because I did this before, but so let's try something else. Const yearly rent. There we go. Equals I don't know, 2,700, something like that. That's weird. I think it's just this console. All right, there we go. Cool. Yeah, so this is sort of how to declare a variable in JavaScript, and you can reference that variable later. So you can say, instead of like a print statement, here we're going to say console.log, and we're going to put the variable in there. It's similar to the way we sort of do like a print line statement in Java, or print statement in Python. And we can also do like traditional like sort of manipulations on those sorts of things. So new var times 3 console.log. Okay. Let sort of does a similar thing. And honestly, like I think like this website was sort of tripping out a little bit before, but I did already declare monthly rent. So if I like type like monthly rent, okay, I refresh the page. So const close to 100. Okay. If I try to redeclare monthly rent, what do you think is gonna happen? It's gonna be like upset, right? Because you can't do that. So if I try to say something like monthly 50, it still gets upset because it's a constant. Whereas if I did something like let var is equal to like 30, and then I printed this, or like I sort of like changed the value later, it would let me do that. Okay, I hope that sort of clears something up. So let would be like that sort of traditional, you can change the value, you can dependent on it to be like correctly scoped. So inside like a for loop is where we would often use the let keyword. And can somebody tell me why like inside like a for loop we would want to use let over for, or let over const?
Because if you're like iterating, you want to be able to change your variable. For example, like you want to increment it, and I guess you wouldn't be able to do that with const, maybe.
Yep, exactly. So there's obviously like different use cases, but mostly when we want to do things like assign values of like functions to a particular like a tag that we're sort of referencing or anything like that, where we sort of like are moving around constant values. And we're not like counting on redefining that value later. We want to use const. It just makes things a lot simpler for us. Cool. So now we can sort of talk about how to link JavaScript and HTML. It's honestly very simple. You actually just pull it up. So in the notes, you could probably find this, but I'm going to pull it up. 21. Okay, there we go. So this is an HTML file that just contains like a simple like HTML breakdown, and we all know how to access like the dev tools from now. A simple way to do it is just to say like Command-Shift-C if you're on a Mac. I'm not sure what the hotkey is for Windows, but when you do that, you can sort of see like the simple like HTML breakdown of the code. So we have like an HTML tag that has a head and a body, and it references this file right here, which I actually haven't made yet, so it's gonna be really confused. But it references experiments.js, and this way we can reference any code that is in that, and we can call any code that is in experiments.js, which has to be, of course, like since we've sourced it as being in the same directory, it would have to be in the same directory. This is all we have to do, similar to like an import statement in another programming language. And we can, of course, do imports in JavaScript as well. In HTML, we can reference JavaScript by adding a script tag with a source. And I think you guys have already seen this before, but if not, the general like context of where to put it. And if we have a header, we usually want to put it inside the header. It doesn't really matter fully where it goes, but by convention, we usually want to put it in the header. In this case, we didn't. Okay, cool. And when we want to look at the console, we can look here. It says failed to load resource because it's actually not in the same thing. I didn't put like experience.js in the same folder as this. But yeah, usually it would be able to load things from there. So when it sends a request out, it gathers the HTML, and then the HTML, if it has any referencing JavaScript that it's also looking for, it grabs the JavaScript as well. But in this case, there is none. The console is sort of the equivalent of the console that we've been looking at so far right here. And it's going to be immensely useful in debugging and understanding how like the flow of your JavaScript is actually working. So I highly encourage you guys to like play around with this and try to get like a feel for it as well. But yeah, let's just go back to this. Cool. So let's just do like a simple sort of comparison between Python and JavaScript, because I think that this is one of the best ways to do it. If you're already familiar with Python, which I think most of you are, it'll be a lot easier to think about it in the terms of that rather than just thinking about it from scratch. So instead of saying something like, in Python, we'd say something like x is equal to 3. In JavaScript, we would say like var x is equal to 3, or we'd say let x or const. Of course, it depends on our types. Var is like the most like flexible type of thing that we can do. So let's just declare it as a variable. We don't need to reference like the fact that it's a string or a number or anything like that. So if I say something like 3, it says undefined, but that's just because it has no output. This particular line of code has no output. And we can also like do multiple assignments by saying like var x comma y comma z. Yeah, let's just these two. And then we've sort of declared them. And then we can set them. So y is equal to 5. would work, and we can put like two things in the same line, because as opposed to Python, which sort of knows how to differentiate two like different lines by like a line break, in JavaScript, just like in Java, it knows how to differentiate it by semicolon alone. So I can say y is equal to 5, and I can say z is equal to 10, and that should work. Cool. And it outputs 10 for whatever reason. But if I say like y, it'll output 5. All right. Yeah, I hope this whole idea about like white spacing and everything is totally fine. In general, like we want to kind of follow this format of spacing. So apart from, of course, like we want to declare these things on separate lines if we were writing like good legible code. We also want to have spaces in between operators and their operands, I guess, and like keywords and their particular like whatever they're like trying to modify or anything like that. So in this case, z space equals space 10 would be like a good way to sort of go about it. And it's also worth noting that these types of things are case sensitive. So x, y is not equal to, oh, so if I say xy is equal to 5, that is not equal to xy. There's no such thing as xy because it is case sensitive. Thus, the camel case actually works. Cool. All right. Another big thing is that, so I think I told you guys that you can comment things out, but I don't think you can do that in the console. So let's just leave it. Another big thing is that you can actually accomplish string concatenation via different methods. So like we're used to sort of concatenating strings together like this, like in the traditional sense, but we don't need to do that. We can also like, we can sort of use something called string interpolation. So yeah, so like if I were to say something like const, okay, I'll do this. Yeah, const greeting equals hello world. Const name equals Abhi, right? So now we've established two variables, greeting and name, which have their own different values. We can sort of use what's called string interpolation to substitute things into another string, substitute these strings into another string without having to like explicitly concatenate them together. So we can say like something like const full greeting equals something like yeah, we'll say something like and this is the syntax for that. There's the dollar symbol and then curly braces, open and closing. So you can say something like greeting, space, comma, yeah, and then the dollar symbol again, and then the other thing, that whatever you want to put in or anything else that you want to put in. You can reference it like that. Yeah, the sentence doesn't make too much sense, but that's sort of like the general idea on how to accomplish that. And so this is all a string right here. This comma is also a string that is included in this. And we're basically just substituting everything inside the dollars and the curly braces with the actual value of that variable. Whatever's inside the curly braces has to be like a variable or something that JavaScript can interpret like a string. So if I actually print out full greeting, we get like the whole string. And this is like pretty important, and I think it's cool, different from other programming languages, some other languages. Okay, does that sort of make sense? Are there any questions? Cool. If there are no questions, we can sort of move forward. And we'll start talking about control flow. So we talked about this a little bit before at the high level, but control flow is basically like if statements and if else statements. And if else statements are conducted similarly to like Java instead of Python. So we can say like if I don't know, 3 is greater than 2. Console.log hi. Great. So this should print hi. How do we do multi-line things in here? Okay. Anyway, but you can also include like else statements. We actually just open up another JavaScript file because that would be good. You share. Okay, here we go. Okay, cool. Yeah, so now we have like a separate JavaScript file. Again, as I said before, I put it in the same like folder this time as the HTML file. This is the HTML file that I was using to control the HTML page that I showed you guys earlier, and its source is the experiments.js file. So I can say something like, I can do like a traditional if-else statement, like if, so I can declare like a constant variable that is equal to a Boolean. So I can say if money is equal to 3, if money is greater than 3, console.log rich. And then else console.log sad. All right. So we would expect to see rich, and that is exactly what we would see. I guess we'll demo this stuff later, but yeah. And then that's kind of the way to accomplish that. And we can also use like equal statements. So if money equals 3. And remember, we want to use 3 equal statements in general. And it should be equal to 3 because 3 is always equal to 3. All right, cool. And we also have things like not equals and greater than equals, greater than, less than equals, all of these things, similar to other programming languages. Cool. All right. I assume that we don't need to like talk about this a little bit more, so we'll go on and move on to loops. So looping is a concept that some of you might have already been introduced to, but basically like instead of saying something like let x is equal to 0, and if suppose we want to just like increase it to 10 over time, we don't have to say something like x plus plus, x plus plus. Like we don't have to like, oh, plus plus is like an increment operator that basically means like x equals x plus 1. So we don't need to do this like 10 times, right? In order to accomplish the result of, I guess, like making x become 10. So instead of that, we can just like create a loop that says like something like for, right? Wow. Okay. So yeah, it's something like this that says like bar I is equal to 10. So 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus, right? You can say something like x plus plus here. And this would increment it 10 times. I hope that makes sense. Okay. There's also while loops, which can be used for a similar purpose, except they utilize like that conditional a little bit more like obviously. So like you can say something like while x is less than 10, x plus plus. Cool. Really easy. And in this case, it would never enter this because it's already 10. All right, so we've gone over most of these things already. We've talked about incrementing, looping, control flow, and most of it, conditionals and everything like that. So before we kind of talk a little bit more about like how to declare functions and what arrays are in JavaScript, I'm going to take a minute to let you guys like sort of digest this and ask any questions if you have them.
Oh, yes, I have a question. So you know how we have to do equals 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 for like less,
Yeah.
for like not equals and greater than equals and less than equals? Is there also like an equivalent comparison thing where there's two equal signs?
Yeah, no, you could just use like less than equals or anything like that.
Okay, and then the same
you
for
don't have
not
to say
equals?
Yeah, for not equals, we generally want to do the not equals equals thing. Sorry, I didn't mention that, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
When you not equals equals instead of like not equals. And this is kind of because like this stuff, like the rest of these, implicitly convert them to like numbers anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Whereas like for this, you could be comparing like two strings together, or you could be comparing, again, you could be comparing some of 2 and 2. If I were to ask JavaScript what this is, it would probably return true. Whereas if I asked it what this is, it would return false, like we want. Does this make sense? Okay, cool. All right, let's run through functions and stuff. Let me know if you guys like actually want to see the output or anything. Also, you can like follow along by doing the same code, and like putting like a random like HTML file that has your JavaScript file as its source, and then it'll work in your console, as I showed you earlier. So printed out sad. I think I forgot to save it last time, so if I just, there we go, we're in the console. And we're rich, so because 3 is equal to 3. Cool. So that's sort of how that works. And you can print stuff out like console log it, similar to like print statements to debug. We can use this to debug. There's better ways to debug it, but this is also one way. I think we can sort of see where the script actually came from by going here. And so this takes us as sources and then experiments.js, and we can look at it and modify it like right here. So right, and then the console will be modified, I believe. No, it just pulls it straight from our local host. So generally we want to like modify stuff there and then come back here. Okay, so let's go back to that. Let's see. All right. So functions are basically like code that you can reuse over and over again. Like that's a reusable code that you can, and sort of we've seen this type of idea before. In CSS, we see this type of idea through the classes. So in classes, we can sort of like define one class and then utilize the styles that we've set there in various different places in our HTML code. If we set it to the same class, it's going to have the same styles. Similar to that, if we call a function, we can expect like a particular kind of result or a particular type of result and a particular type of computation. So if I were to, and there's several ways to declare functions in JavaScript, but one like very explicit way to do it is just to say function. I don't know. Say like calc rent is equal to, okay, and then like similar to Java, we have like the parameters that go inside parentheses. And this could have like, I don't know, take in some sort of value in there. So, and we don't really need to like elaborate on what type of value that we want inside it or anything like that. But we can just say like we want a number that goes in there. And this has a return statement. So we can say number times 100. It's not a really like robust calculation, but it works. So we can just say like, we can call this function by saying like const, I don't know, final rent is equal to calc rent money. As always, we want to enter sentences with semicolons. Okay. If this makes sense. There's other ways to actually like declare functions in JavaScript. And one of those types of ways that we'll talk about heavily later on is the idea of an arrow function. In JavaScript, I guess ES8, I think, they introduced like this idea of arrow functions, which are essentially like anonymous functions, if you guys are familiar with those, that are similar to like lambdas in Python. But for now, we won't talk about those. And of course, like they don't necessarily need to take in any particular parameter value, but it does add like some sort of like parameter that you want to add. Okay. Yeah, so JavaScript has a lot of functions that are already made for it. So one of those functions is like just like how like Python has like the len function. We can use like a whole bunch of different functions in JavaScript, and one of those is the entire like math library. In Java, I think we need to import the math library, but in JavaScript we can just call different sorts of things. So we can say something like console.log math.max 3,2, and it should return 2. We can also like log something like you can also have like string methods, which are like very common, and these are similar to like string methods you can find in anything. So const message is equal to this. We can log like something like message dot length, I think. Or even better, we can say like substr, which is basically like a substring, and that takes in a that takes in 2 parameters. It takes in the start index, and of course, like JavaScript, just like a lot of other languages, is 0 index. So we can say like something like 0, comma, and then this is the second parameter is the number of characters to include. So something like 5 would return just the word we're, and that's what you would get. And this is a built-in function. It's kind of like an overview of built-ins. Cool. All right, so we've seen like one example of, or we've talked about like all these different types of data types before. For example, like strings and numbers and everything like that. But we haven't really gotten to why they're useful in any sort of way. Obviously, like one use case of them would be like if we had like a number equal to like a value that's not even a number, we can't really like loop through this value, right? So we would need this to be a value. And the way to check like the actual type of something for debugging later is to say something like type of, which is like another type of like, I guess this is a keyword in JavaScript. And we can just check if that's the case. But mostly like in JavaScript, we don't really need to worry about like typing that much, right? Because we can sort of like assign and reassign at will, and we can sort of like not have to worry that things won't break because they're the wrong type, if that makes sense. But that also does cause like some problems, and it causes developers some worry because you don't know if you're doing something wrong. Versus in C will be like, okay, yeah, your whole computer crashed, system allocation error, whatever. But it's similar to Python in JavaScript, where you don't really need to worry too much about it. Cool. So let's just talk about two more built-in functions. There's the Parsing function, which is another built-in function that can sort of convert a string to a number. And there's also the, yeah, I guess we can just, this is good. There's others. There's like math.round, and there's a lot of different types of object methods that we can talk about. But for the most part, let's also talk about like the idea of like undefined and null. We've seen not a number before, but undefined is also something that you might get if, I guess we've also seen that before as well. If we were try to reference like a number that, or a variable that doesn't exist, and null can represent like a falsy value. So if we, for example, try to index out of an array, or if we have like a value in an array that hasn't been declared yet, that is going to be like a null value. And we can also set values to null. And like if we were to look outside of an array bounds, it would return an undefined. Awesome. So finally, I guess let's review the idea of objects. So you guys might have heard of like JavaScript object notation. It's like a very widely used sort of system for objects and everything like that. So one of those JavaScript objects, like you can sort of declare them like this. So use like the canonical example, you could say like something like animal, or actually no, let's say it better yet. So dog is equal to, and then we have like the name, and these are comma separated, and they're essentially key value pairings. So let's just leave it like this, but we could add, okay, let's just add in like breed. In this case, it doesn't matter if I do like quotes or like single quotes or double quotes. I'll leave it as double quotes. And then if I say something like dog.name, it'll return Felix. Super simple stuff. All of this stuff is basically like intuitive and sort of review, but that is what it is. We can also say something like dog name, and this will also return Felix. Actually, no, that wouldn't. This would return Felix. Okay, but let's leave it like this for now. Cool. So yeah, so this doesn't necessarily need to be like a variable. It can also just be like a string, similar to that. But yeah, so that's kind of how that goes. And again, objects in JavaScript are oriented as key value pairs, separated by colons, for its key colon value. And you can use them like pretty much anywhere, and even in like a const value, I think you can mutate one of the properties of the object if you declare it as this. So I could say like dog.name is equal to Lucky or something, and it would be able to modify it. But yeah. And also, yeah, well, I guess I want to talk a little bit more about objects, JavaScript objects, because they're very important and they're used absolutely everywhere, whether it's like API calls or, I don't know, like you want to store a value to a particular database, you're going to probably be using JavaScript object notation. It's similar to something like CSV, like comma separated values that are used in various different ways. Like you can sort of export things as comma separated values if you're making an Excel sheet, and then later like process it with your code. Similar to that, like you can usually download or export things as JSON values, where JSON is JavaScript object notation. So this is very useful to know. We can have like whole like types of objects. So like we could say something like identifiers as like, and then like have this be a nested object within that. And this can like have multiple objects inside it. So like something like traits, speed, fast. I don't know. Mom. So I think we want to keep these things like consistently typed. So we could say something like is Jenny. There we go. Now we have like ancestry and general identifiers, but that's how to sort of nest things together. And we could say something like dog dot identifiers dot name. Okay, hope this makes sense. And if I print dog, it'll return like that whole object. So if I were to just log the whole object, it would say, it would sort of spit all that out, and we can see that. We'll look at that later as well. But these right here, what I've sort of described is an object, and I sort of used it interchangeably with the idea of like a JSON object, but that's not like 100% right. The reason I did that is because it's actually very easy to translate this object into a JSON object. Similar to like a comma separated value, it's easy to sort of export an Excel sheet as a CSV. You can easily change or convert a JavaScript object into a JSON value. And the way we do that is to use this method called JSON.stringify. And that converts something like dog into its JSON counterpart. And the way that would look to the computer is something like quite similar, I guess, to the way we've done it, except it's sort of like a little bit more organized. So like it would say like something like identifiers colon this. It might even do that. Name colon Felix, so on and so forth. Okay. But anyway, this converts it to that JSON. And you can access a JSON object the same way as we've accessed an object, a traditional JavaScript object. With one like tiny exception is that these objects can be single quoted, like I said before, but JSON objects, if you're actually just identifying them like or generating them from scratch, you need to make sure that they are surrounded by double quotes. There is like a reason for that in JavaScript, but we won't go too much into that as well. I guess one final thing that we should probably talk about or set of things is the idea of like simple data structures like arrays and everything like that. And so like yeah, so let's just talk about arrays. So like if we were to create an array of I don't know, what's an array that we could make? Languages. English, no, Spanish, Hindi, JavaScript. There we go. This is sort of like a list of languages that we've made. And we can access it much the same way as we can access like arrays in other programming languages using the index operator. So we can say languages 0, and that will output that. Output English, I mean. We could also just like log the whole thing, and it will return the whole array. If we have an array, we can actually loop through it in a really special way. So if we say languages dot for each, we can actually loop through all the values in this, similar to the idea of like in Python, we have for in languages. Similar to that, we have the for each loop in similar to the idea in Java. And I think C as well, I'm not sure. We can just do like a for each loop that kind of operates on each like one particular value of a an array that we're operating on. So in this case, we're operating on language array, and then we look at each particular language, and we can do stuff to it except mutate it. We can't really mutate something like this, but that's sort of how we would loop through that. We can also loop through it like traditionally, just by calling the length method. So we can actually just say like, so let's do this outside. I think I said it was a length method. It's actually a length attribute. But yeah, that's something that you can do in arrays. That's sort of like native to it. Yeah, so that's sort of like the very basics of arrays and stuff in general. There's definitely a lot more to it, obviously, like in terms of concatenating different arrays together or potentially, filtering through them. There's also the whole idea of like mapping, which is extremely important. So we can say something like languages dot map, and then map takes in like its own like function, and you can sort of identify that function to be whatever you want. Not message, but lang key, and then if I do this, and I can like sort of console.log. You guys will learn about this method in like more detail later, in a better context. But this is sort of like a way to go over each of the elements of an array and then sort of do something to it. And this is extremely useful when it comes to something like you want to output a whole bunch of different things in a list, particularly useful in things like React. But yeah, so this has all been a very like quick crash course of all the different things that JavaScript has as part of its magical programming bundle. Of course, like as you can tell, this is just the fundamentals of like programming, and it's not really like specific to JavaScript. There's a couple of quirks, but mostly it's like things that translate to any other language as well. So there's like any functionality that you can think of that's present in other programming languages, chances are that you can accomplish it with this. People have built entire like, I don't know, like machine learning systems or models or whatever in JavaScript. people build applications using it, front end, back end, everything. So it's like, it's all like a very it's a very powerful programming language that can be used for anything, but it is similar to like any other programming language that you'll see. So let's just take like a really quick look at what we see in the console after like seeing all of this, after like saving all of these files, I guess. Everything that we've done here. Let's reload it. It gets upset. Let me just sort of, I didn't really proofread my code as I was writing it. So language is not defined. I accidentally referenced the language. There we go. All right, cool. So this is like sort of like the output that we see. This is a JavaScript object, and this is a JSON file, a JSON string, I guess. And as you can see, these things are very similar. In fact, it sort of like converts it to that at first, but in a JavaScript, in a JSON thing, like everything is a string, as you can see here. That's not always the case for JavaScript objects, but we tend to use JSON a little bit more in when we're like doing API calls or anything like that. So it's very useful to know. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing now. I hope this style of lecture was sort of like useful. Like I tried to do it like a little bit more demo style. I do also have slides for this, and maybe like if there's like demand for it, like I'll also just release the slides as well, which will give like a summary of like all these various concepts that we learned. But I think most of these concepts are better learned through doing an example. So I encourage you to like play around with the console on your own, make this experiments.json file, JS file, and then like inject your own JavaScript into your code. Next lecture and the following lectures, we'll talk about how to really integrate these things together with your HTML, you know, through like get element by ID or whatever else. And that way you can make like full scale, like not just static web applications, but dynamic websites that can like sort of do like a whole bunch of things and are super interactive to the user. So yeah, looking forward to that. But yeah, so I think we've gone through like most of the content that we wanted to get through. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that we talked about?
I guess we didn't really cover this, but when will we cover like I guess how it works in like respect to like HTML and CSS? Like so, for example, making the functionality of that button work.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that next lecture. But as you saw right here, this is one example of actually like using JavaScript in your code in like a really bad way, but like still, if we wanted to reference like a function, for example, like a button on click function, we can create that function in JavaScript, and then if we've loaded that JavaScript file in our script tag, we can reference that particular function straight in our JavaScript code. And that will sort of be explained and elaborated on a little bit more. But what we did today was actually use like a JavaScript code inside of our HTML by going to our console and seeing what it printed out. Just sort of like a rote way to do it. But yeah, I hope that was like good enough an explanation. Okay, cool. Anybody else? Any other questions at all? All right, sweet. If we don't have any more questions, I'll probably just end the recording here. I will stick around for a couple more minutes if you guys have any more questions though, so we can